The following is a Hoop Ball presentation. Welcome to the Fantasy NBA Today podcast.
Well, I have to admit, folks, I got to about Tuesday afternoon before I remembered that the Wednesday podcast was going to be a solo show, and I didn't have any more sports betting to talk about. So, it's Mailbag Day, ladies and gentlemen. Mailbag Day. Thank you to those that sent questions in on Twitter. They came fast, and they came furious. The mailbag request was sent out at about 5 or 6 p.m. on Pacific time, and by about 8:30 Pacific time, we had more than enough questions to do an entire podcast. So thanks, everybody. That's awesome. Good to see folks are getting back into this swing of things. That's a type of response that I think in July or August would take about 2 days, and in September it takes 2 hours. You guys are paying attention to basketball again. That is clear. What's happening, everybody? Welcome to Fantasy NBA Today. I am Dan Besbris, at Dan Besbris, your gracious host. Thanking you, as always, for tuning in. I suppose it's that time of year to start talking about ratings and reviews on the pod. Subscriptions as well. As many of you find this podcast for a first time, I will go through the iTunes algorithm part of things. And I don't want to spend a ton of time on it because, well, frankly, it's boring. And it'll make a lot of you want to turn the podcast off. But at the risk of that, please do take a moment to rate and review the podcast. If you like it in particular, we do appreciate those 5-star reviews and positive comments on it, things that you find interesting or helpful. We like all of that stuff. These things are our lifeblood. For a free podcast, subscriptions, actually, when you subscribe to the podcast, that's what moves it up the charts. And then other people can find it. And if it has good ratings, other people will click on it. So it's a combo plate. We need subscriptions, we need ratings and reviews, and that will lead to additional people actually listening to the show. So again, appreciate everybody's time. If you have a moment to do that, you can do it very easily using iTunes on an actual computer. It's really simple. You just go to the podcast page, and there's a ratings and review button. On the phone, at least, I didn't check today to make sure, but last year it's a little bit more convoluted. The podcast app, if you're on an Apple mobile device, you have to search for the show and then click on the show title, not an episode title. That's the confusing part. Once you're at the show page, there's a rating and review button. You can click on that, and we'll be thankful forever. Another thing I wanted to make brief mention of on today's podcast is, and I've said this a few times, the draft guide. Still for sale, still $13.99 and worth every stinking penny. I didn't ask this gentleman if I could use his reply as a testimonial, so I'm not going to use his Twitter handle, but a person, a loyal hoopball follower, someone that actually I think has been following my stuff more than all of the other hoopball stuff, so more podcast, said, by the way, the draft guide is awesome and worth every penny. His words, not mine. I just repeated them now. So thank you for that testimonial. To those of you out there who love fantasy draft information, that is the one-stop shop. And as I've said before, and I've lectured you for a week now, almost every day, on how ADP is the big tool that you just need to use, and you'll win your draft. You'll win your draft. Almost simple as that. You'll be able to, if you know ADP and you know what the people in your league are like, basically who they read, what sources they use, you only need that one piece of information, and you can beat them. And the ADP stuff in the draft guide is just phenomenal, especially as we get towards October. So again, that's $13.99, $2 off if you're a repeat subscriber. If you are not a DFS player yet, but you're interested in perhaps becoming one, we've got an even better deal that is officially live now. All you have to do is go to DraftKings, sign up using the Hoopball, I don't know what you'd call it, not a referral link because it's not a pyramid scheme. It's the click-through, I guess. It's a cookie so that DraftKings knows that Hoopball sent you there. So all you got to do is go to the Hoopball DraftKings partnership page, click through. Open a DraftKings account and put $10 in it, and you get the draft guide for free. And the season pass, I think. Right? Was that? No, just the season pass. I got to get my promos right here. That's the season pass. So that's up for grabs now. The draft guide remains $13.99. So there, I almost biffed it. I corrected myself, and now you got it. Draft guide's $13.99. You can get the season pass for free. There's also a draft guide season pass combo plan. And if you do that draft guide deal and things all don't take place by themselves in the magical internet sphere, you can always email us. We had a couple people that did the draft guide promo last year, and because they did the hoop ball click through, but they closed their computer and then they booted it back up again, but they forgot to click through hoop ball a second time, we took care of you guys. Okay? It's obviously better if you make sure you do the click through. We don't have to go through all these back channels. It'll all take care of itself. But should you run into some sort of issue, we have customer service reps that are waiting for your call. They are named Aaron Brewski. So again, welcome to the podcast. Thanks for listening, everybody. I appreciate you taking the time here at the beginning of the show to indulge me on the promo stuff we've got going on at Hoop Ball. And without further ado, it's mailbag time. Question number 1, and I'm going to look at these basically chronologically because, frankly, I'm just panning my Twitter deal as we go through it. We'll answer the questions as they come in. It'll be a lot like our in-season podcast where we just take questions from the chat room one after the other. From Dandy Longlegs. Dandy Longlegs, I like that. He is in Perth. He's an Aussie. Who is your Thad Nico love for this coming season? So that's a question about the Besbris bunch. For those of you that did not listen last year, and I know there's a handful of you now because we're into that sort of fresh new subscribers portion of the proceedings. If you didn't listen last year, I had 2 guys that I considered what I ended up calling the Besbris bunch. It was Thaddeus Young and Nico Mirotic, guys that I were beyond 100 in their ADP, and comfortably, as it turned out, beyond 100. Thad was going in the 120s, 130s. Nico was going probably about 10 slots earlier, 10 to 15, who I believed each had top 75 potential. And with Nico, I thought there was some top 50 upside on the docket there. So the short version, the short answer to this question is they're not ready yet, because we need to see a little bit more on ADP to get a feel for what guys are actually going to be really late ADP guys, right? That's what this comes down to. You don't want me to come on here and tell you, hey, here's, a top 50 guy who I think is going to be a top 40 guy. That's not the big steals that you're looking for here. You guys are all hoping for another 2-pack like that. And I'll be honest with you, I don't know that there's going to be a 2-pack like that every year of 2 guys that are just going to blow their ADPs out of the water. And aside from the face punching, there was really no sweat involved in it. Just none. It was so simple. Thaddeus Young, right from the outset, he was like top 60 and he just never looked back. Nico, face punching, but when he came back, he was trucking along at a top 40 clip on a per game basis. So I don't know that anybody's going to be quite that obvious, but as I look through the 100 to 150 range of players, a few guys jump out as possibilities. We mentioned Kyle Anderson, slow-mo, as someone on one of our recent podcasts. These are not, by the way, I'm going to preface this once again, these are not the Besbris bunch guys. These are dudes that I believe have an opportunity to jump into that group. And this, again, is basically 100 to 150 guys in that ADP range that I believe could post top 75 or even potentially top 50 value. But I haven't locked it down yet, so don't put anything in stone over there. I don't want this to go out as, hey, here's Dan's 2 guys. But just a quick glance at that 100 to 150 range, a couple of the names that jump out, and I'm trying to dodge the dudes that are right at 100 because, picking a guy at 100 that ends up as top 90, that's pretty whack. That almost doesn't help you because they're so similar in that range. But Kent Bazemore had a pretty good season last year. He should be basically in that wheelhouse again, although he is a strong candidate to be traded this year. I just believe that as long as he's with the Hawks, he's going to have a prominent role keeping things under control. He and Jeremy Lin. Nick Batum has an ADP of 108 with Dwight Howard out of town, and Batum, by all accounts, healthy going into this season. He should be able to get back near that 60-70 range that he had posted in seasons past. I mean, there's really no... Last year, we faded him because of Dwight Howard and because of the injury. So he fell. I mean, he's one of those ones where it's like, oh, we have a track record for this dude. He's getting older, but by all accounts, Charlotte's going to utilize him more than he did in the past. Larry Nance Jr. at around 110. He's a guy that should be easily inside the top 100. I don't know that we can safely say top 75 because he never stays healthy. Scanning a little bit farther down the list, I mentioned Slow-Mo. He's around 119. Avery Bradley at 122. He's never going to be the Avery Bradley that he was in Boston, but he's now out from underneath the Drummond and DeAndre Jordan shadow. Marcin Gortat is not the rebounder that DeAndre Jordan is, or Andre Drummond. They're just not. So he has a chance for a nice little bounce-back season. Trevor Ariza, by the way, of all the names that I've said so far, he probably has the strongest chance to be a member of the Besbris bunch. His ADP is at 126 right now. 126. This is a guy that's basically been top 60 every year, and by all accounts, his role in Phoenix might be bigger than his role in Houston. So there's another one. Jaren Jackson Jr. is in that mix, but I'm not throwing him in the Besbris bunch because I think he's going to be a hype train guy where his ADP is going to skyrocket out of control, and you're going to have to blow way too early of a pick to end up with him. DeJounte Murray is in that area. Reggie Jackson is not good, but he's at 130-something, and if healthy, he should be able to exceed that a little bit. And that's probably your guys in that 100 to 150 range. Maybe Jonathan Isaac could dump in there if you believe that his health could improve. So those are candidates. Those are candidates, guys. I want to stress this. Those are candidates for the Besbris bunch. We'll narrow it down. I might even take a look at guys, basically everyone from like 75 to 200 by the time this is all and done. But in at first glance, those are some names that are guys that I believe to be, they're not sleepers, right? Because the Besbris bunch are guys that have a track record. We've seen Thad Young do it for 1,000,000 years last season when we put him in the Besbris bunch. With Niko Mirotic, we saw him do it in March each of the previous 2 years, and then the coming season, this most recent one, by all accounts, he was the starting power forward for that team before he got socked in the mug. So there's no reason to discount that. So that's what we're looking for with those guys. I'm not a risky fantasy guy, as you know about me. So when we look at these types of dudes, it's guys that have track record where they're just being, for whatever reason, overlooked for being old or boring. Question number 2, I'm in a dynasty league, and we're on our 3rd season. We're allowed to keep 5 guys. Who among the following players would you suggest? This is a pretty narrow question, but we're going to answer it anyway. I'm not going to spend a ton of time on the specifics of it, but if it leads us down any roads, we will follow them. The names are Kemba Walker, De'Aaron Fox, Will Barton, TJ Warren, Serge Ibaka, Jonas Valanciunas, and Blake Griffin. Provided I understand the question correctly, you can keep 5, but it would probably be your first 5 picks you're giving up? Or does it correspond potentially to where these guys were drafted last season? If it's where they were drafted last season, the guys that probably have an arrow pointed up are Jonas Valanciunas. He played well last year, and we've heard that he should see maybe an extra minute or 2 in the Toronto offense this season, especially with Jakob Poeltl out of town. I know they still have Pascal Siakam and Bebe, but someone's got to get the minutes, right? If Poeltl was playing 18 to 20 minutes, those are not all going to go to Siakam and Bebe. 1 or 2 of those at least will go to a guy like Valanciunas. So he's a guy with an arrow pointed up. Blake Griffin, no. I don't think his arrow was pointed up. Serge Ibaka, no. TJ Warren, no. Phoenix is trying to go a little older, a little bit less ball chucky. De'Aaron Fox, his arrow is pointed up, but if you're keeping him, I hope that you're only giving up like a 10th or later round draft pick because he's still a young point guard. Will Barton, arrow pointed more or less sideways, maybe a tiny bit down if Denver stays healthy, especially now with IT in town, and he's a guy who gets his shots. And then Kemba Walker, I actually think his arrow is pointed ever so slightly up because Dwight Howard is back out of town, and you guys know how I feel about the Dwight effect. I've made that abundantly clear. Now, the opposite possibility here, you're just giving up your first 5 picks in a dynasty league, right? It's dynasty. It's not just keeper, so you get these guys forever. If it's a small dynasty league, I think, Kemba's a guy you definitely hold on to. He's probably a top 20 guy this year with Dwight gone. I would say almost guaranteed top 30. That's a pretty good guy to have on your team in a dynasty league, especially because he probably does have another 3-4 good seasons in him. Will Barton, he's a young guy, just kind of getting rolling. Blake Griffin, for all of his warts, his fantasy warts, if you're in an 8-cat format, he's a guy you could probably hang on to, but, injury stuff is rough. So you kind of have to know a little bit more, I think, to answer this question appropriately. It depends on what you're giving up, really, to hold on to some of these players. If it's just coming down to who I like, Kemba's an automatic yes. Will Barton I like. Valanciunas, slight arrow up, and De'Aaron Fox, slight arrow up, but I'm not as high on De'Aaron Fox as everybody else is. The, dodging De'Aaron stuff that went through Summer League in the regular season last year. I mean, Sacramento had a lot of problems, so they were sort of grasping at what the good news might be. He's going to get the keys, we would assume, someday. So I don't know that he's going to help your team win a dynasty league this season, but maybe 2-3 years down the line, he becomes more of a top 75 kind of guy. Moving on to question number 3. I know I wasn't planning on taking a ton of time with that one. I think it was only like a 3 or 4 minute answer. It seems like, this is from VP. By the way, the second question was from Jay Chio. VP says, seems like you can get steals. He made a pun. It seems like you can steal them in the later part of drafts. Guys like Slow-Mo, DeJounte Murray, Jonathan Isaac, Mario Hezonja. Would you bump up assists early because elite point guards are rare? A lot of injury risk as the point guard spot. CP3, John Wall, Kyrie Irving, Mike Conley, Kyle Lowry. Who's your reliable point guard left? I am not. I'm going to break this question down into a couple of pieces. Can you get steals in the later part of the draft? Yes. Threes and steals are often available as specialist type guys. They don't tend to be top 100 players. Maybe sometimes they can squeeze into that part of the overall totals. But I have found that if you want to make a push in something like steals or threes, you can usually do it. You just end up having to sacrifice other stuff. Some of the names that were brought up here, Jonathan Isaac, steals and blocks, it seemed like he was going to be able to pick up in droves if he had playing time, but the other stuff in his game a long way away, right? So if you had Jonathan Isaac, you were likely surrendering points, percentages, assists, maybe even rebounds. DeJounte Murray, he's a steals, rebounds kind of guy, smattering of assists as well. Doesn't score very much. Okay, field goal percent number, pretty bad. Free throws, not great. Turnovers as he gets more responsibility. So these later guys that have the steals upside, they're a little bit more specialist-y. And so you just sort of you tack it on like that. Yes, you could potentially go light on steals early in your draft and plug in a specialist later. I just don't know that I'd game plan for that. I don't think that I would look at the early part of the draft and say, you know what, I'm going to dodge steals because I think there's some guys I could get later on. You know me. You know I'm a best player available kind of dude. So, if it comes down to 2 guys in the second round and one of them is better at steals than the other, I don't think that I would necessarily just gravitate towards the guy who gets fewer steals or maybe gets more assists, to segue to the second half of this question, because stats are just kind of available everywhere. Nothing is quite as limiting as it seems. What it comes down to is, can you get guys who are good at multiple categories? There's always somebody out there who can give you one statistical category. There just aren't that many guys that can do a bunch of them, and those that can tend to be very early picks. So the second half of this question is, would you bump up assists to get them earlier in the draft? And my answer to this one, by the way, is also not really. I think that as soon as you put those notions in your head on draft day, you start to muck up the rest of your draft. You take a guy earlier than he should be taken because you're concerned about one statistical category. At the end of the day, if your team is middle of the pack in assists, that's not going to stop you from winning the league. And, by the way, we have an NBA these days, maybe more than, I don't want to say more than ever before, because there have been eras, we sort of go through the ups and the downs of things, but you can do a little exercise here. Go to Yahoo or ESPN and look at last season's numbers and sort based on assists. You get into forwards and centers not as late as you might expect. Let's say that. It's not super early, but LeBron James, number 3 in the league, by all accounts, he's a forward. Draymond Green, I believe, was 8th in the NBA in assists. He's a forward and a center. Nikola Jokic, he's inside the top 20. Blake Griffin inside the top 20. Boogie was inside the top 25 before he got there. Nick Batum, he's a wingman. He's got forward eligibility, and he was putting up 5.5 assists last year. And at the next page is actually even more revealing. As you get into that 4 and 5 range, you start to see a ton of forward and center eligible guys that'll get you 4, 5, 5.5 assists per game. A lot of them, yes, relatively early picks. Kevin Durant, Giannis Antetokounmpo. But you've also got DeMar DeRozan, Joe Ingles, Al Horford was a name that I knew would pop up in there someplace. I think if he was there for an entire season, you probably would have seen Millsap. Will Barton was over 4 assists a game. Chris Middleton was at 4. Brandon Ingram, who I really don't like as a fantasy player, he was at 4. James Johnson. Kent Bazemore was at 3.5. Okay. At this point, we're just rattling off names, and it's annoying. But the point of it is, if you miss out on one of the guys getting 8 or 9 assists per game, okay, maybe your team is not going to be number 1 in the league in assists. Your team is probably also not going to be dead last in turnovers. Take it with a grain of salt. The top 4 guys in the league in assists all averaged 3.9 or more turnovers per game. John Wall at 3.9, by the way, he was the low one. Rajon Rondo was the sort of goofball in that mix at 8 assists and 2.3 turnovers. Chris Paul, also relatively low on the turnover scale. So, there's that risk-reward thing. 8-cat, yeah, I suppose you could grab those guys early and then you're not worried about the turnover aspect of things. But in 9-cat, it almost behooves you to find guys that are a little bit more assist-to-turnover ratio-y and a little less maximum assist-y. That makes sense. They're out there. That's what I'm saying. They are out there. Jeff Teague, mid-round guy, gets you assists. There's the other half of this equation. I was saying you could get it potentially from a different position on the floor, but you could also just get it from a guard a little bit later. I know there's all this fear with injury stuff. Yes, there are a few guys you put into that bucket, but you just can't lump everybody into the injury bucket. Nick Batum, Kemba, talking about guys here that maybe you can get after the first round. Spencer Dinwiddie last year, he put up big assist numbers. Darren Collison, he was a really nice mid-round, big assist-to-turnover ratio kind of guy. Really liked that a lot. Ricky Rubio, you guys all hate him for some reason, but he was at 5 and change assists last year. Lou Williams, Tyreek Evans, Bledsoe, Goran Dragic, who, by the way, always overrated, but does get you almost 5 assists a game. They are out there, is what I'm saying. You pick your poison a little bit. If you don't get a point guard in the first round and a half, you don't have to reach. You don't have to take a guy that, should go in the third round at the end of the second round if there's someone else out there that's going to put up better numbers. So don't hamstring yourself by forcing a point guard early just because you want to cash in on assists. There's a couple other people probably going to do the same thing. I think you're better off getting a nice smattering of statistics. And frankly, I think getting a guy who blocks shots that doesn't kill you in other percentages is a harder thing to locate. I'd probably lean that way. Christian says, I'd like to hear about how Tibbs and the shenanigans between Karl Anthony Towns and Jimmy Butler might affect their fantasy values this season. That's a really interesting question. Because we've addressed this scenario more often with respect to betting situations, where those guys not getting along and Cat's sort of long-running issues with focus might cost the Timberwolves some ball games. But from a fantasy standpoint, we didn't really see it impact them last year. You know, Jimmy Butler ended up becoming the vocal leader on the floor with this team, and both guys were having fantastic fantasy seasons up to a certain point. So I don't know that the shenanigans, the issues, the locker room stuff is going to carry out into the fantasy numbers. I don't think that is something you should bank on if you were planning on taking Cat, at the third pick or whatever it was. I don't think I'd bump him down because of a fear that he and Jimmy Butler don't get along particularly well. Same deal with Jimmy Butler. His ADP is in the 20s right now. If you're planning on taking him a little bit earlier than that, because historically he's been better than that, I don't think I would make any adjustment there because of beef with Karl Anthony Towns. If Jimmy Butler gets traded mid-season, he's still going to be a top 25 guy wherever he goes. He's very, very good. There almost aren't any teams in the NBA where if you stick him on there, he becomes like a fourth option. It's not going to happen. It's not in his nature. He's an alpha dog. What I would worry about is the Tibbs side of things. Is Tom Thibodeau running these clowns into the dirt and breaking them? Because it doesn't ruin their per-game value, but it definitely would put a dent into their totals value. And that's rough, regardless of format, head-to-head or roto. Well, I know everybody's loved the Timberwolves in head-to-head because the guys just sort of play every single day, regardless of what kind of playoff situation they're in. I think they're going to be fighting for the last playoff spot this year, so if those guys are healthy, you can probably bank on them playing down the stretch. But the if they're healthy part, to me, I don't believe Cat goes all 82 again. 4 seasons in a row with a handful of them under Tom Thibodeau, he's going to wear down. Likewise for Jimmy Butler, he's been under Tibbs basically every season of his career, and we already saw the wear and tear begin to take shape a couple seasons ago. I don't know why I feel like everybody said, oh, it finally happened last year where Jimmy Butler wasn't an issue until this most recent season, and then he tried to play through an injury, and he got himself hurt, and blah, blah, blah. Jimmy Butler has not been an all 82 guy since his second year in the league. And I said this on yesterday's podcast, I think. 82 games, 2012-2013 season. Since then, 67, 65, 67, 76. Huzzah. By the way, who was that under? Not Tom Thibodeau. And 59 last year. And the funny thing is, the 76-game season, he still played 37 minutes a game, so it wasn't like he dialed it back on the time on the floor, but they dialed it back on the pressure. The energy expenditure on the floor is just so high with Thibodeau. Guys just going, he will grind them into a pulp, into the dirt, like I said a moment ago, and Butler is just the kind of guy who will react to that. He'll say, okay, coach wants me to go. I'm going to go. 185%. I'm going to go until the wheels come off. So Tibbs is going to run him out. He's going to. It's not an if, it's a when. When is Jimmy Butler going to miss his 3 weeks of NBA action this year? And you just hope that it's only about that long. You hope he only misses 10 to 12 games. So that is obviously a ding on Jimmy Butler. But a guy with top 12 upside playing 70 games is still a top 20-ish fantasy player. Just because guys at the top, their numbers are so huge, they have such an impact that every game they're on the floor just means that much more than everybody else. Do you think Joel Embiid, this is from Alt Snacks, do you think Joel Embiid will be on a minutes or game restriction? And do you think Zach LaVine, is this his breakout year? Well, I suppose we can work backwards through this one. For Zach LaVine, sort of. Which I realize is sort of the lamest possible answer I could have given to that question. If you compare this season, this upcoming, to last year, it might seem a little bit like a breakout season, but I would argue that his third year in the league, the final year with Minnesota, before he got hurt, he was sort of in the middle of breaking out. He averaged 19 points a game on 46% shooting that year, 3.5 rebounds, 3 assists, and about a steal per game. 2.6 three-pointers per game. He actually had that three-point percentage all the way up near 39%. Things were looking very good for LaVine, and one could argue that even last year, if he had been able to sort of stay on the floor long enough, if the Bulls had allowed him to stay on the floor long enough to get his legs fully underneath him, we might have seen that continue. So I think what you need to do is treat last year as a little bit of the outlier. If you're drawing a line, if you're making this kind of a linear graph, you kind of have to go best fit and just assume that what you saw in year 3, his junior year in the NBA, if you want to call it that, at those numbers in Minnesota, I think those are probably closer to what we see this coming season. He will have a large amount of responsibility on that Chicago team that's going to be playing fast. They've got a lot of guys that want buckets, though, so he's going to have to make sure that there are better looks. There's going to have to be a bit more passing than what we saw last year. Thing is, what we've seen now is he sort of is who he is. He's not going to be a big-time steals guy. He's going to get you some threes, points, and league average assists, basically, around 3. Not going to rebound a ton. He's on a Chicago team that's actually decent on the glass. Guys are going to be getting boards away from him. So expect the 3 and change rebounds, the around 3 assists, the around 1 steal, maybe a tiny bit less. Well, depending on how things go with this team, around 1 steal, around, 2 to 2.5 3-pointers per game. That type of stuff, I think, probably holds. So what you're looking at is a guy who, without much in the defensive categories, it's tough for him to sort of max out, especially when the rebounds and assists aren't that high. So you're probably looking at, like a top 65, top 60, top 65, top 70 kind of guy. He's not going to get over that hump and be a super early round asset. I see him listed at 69.6, the early ADP on Zach LaVine, and I don't think that's that far off from where he should be going. You have to, ask yourself if you trust that he will remain healthy for the season, and I think he probably will. I don't think there's any reason to doubt it. Something could happen. Obviously, things can always happen, but you just sort of take him with a grain of salt, hope that it all works out as well as it can. Do I think Joel Embiid will be on a minutes or game restriction this year? No, but he's probably going to miss some games. That's what we've seen from Embiid so far. If suddenly he just busts out of it this year, then outstanding. But Philadelphia feels like they're in pretty good position to make the playoffs. I think they feel like they're in pretty good shape to get a top 3 spot in the East. Do they run him ragged to try to get the number 2 seed, which would extend home court for one additional round? Would they try to push to get the number 1 seed, which could potentially push home court for another round? No, I don't think that that's going to be the difference maker for them. So I would say expect him to miss a handful of games this year, and if he gets into the mid to high 60s, that's probably a win. They don't want to push him that hard because we've seen what happens when he gets pushed a little bit. He gets hurt. Simple as that. So if you're drafting Joel Embiid, understand that he's probably not going to be shooting for 82 games. That's not his target. His target's probably 75, and then you hope he only misses like maybe 2 weeks beyond that. That's where I sit with Embiid, and it's why I remain a little bit more bearish on him than the general fantasy public. Especially in 9-cat, where we saw turnovers were just colossal. Tyler Boone asks, what's the best potential value outside the top 80, which I guess is pretty close to that first question we answered, so I'm not going to double up on that one. Look back to the beginning of this podcast where I listed all the guys in that 100 to 150 range that I thought could potentially jump into the Besbris bunch category. And then we'll, of course, whittle that down as we make our way through the rest of the offseason here. A few more weeks before we can really say, okay, here's the guys. Do I steer clear from bad teams this year, too? Last year I had the no Kings allowed. I also had a no Mavericks allowed for stretches last season. And my short answer is, yeah, probably. I mean, I think there's a little bit more clarity with Sacramento just in terms of removing a guy like George Hill from the equation near the All-Star break. Removing anything that got removed made everything else a little bit more clear. I still don't like the fact that they're going to be awful, and so there's sort of no reason to just turn terrible players loose. They want to try to coach people up. With that in mind, I think you look at this Kings team, and I think that there's a little bit more. There's an expectation that a guy like Buddy Hield is going to play decent minutes. A guy like Bogdanovich is probably going to play decent minutes. I think you could argue De'Aaron Fox is probably going to play decent minutes. I think you could argue Bagley will likely play decent minutes as well. That's the one they got, right? I mess up Bagley and Wendell Carter. These three name junior or the thirds and juniors get the seconds and the thirds are getting me all mishmashed here. I don't trust young players, as you guys know, but we saw Bogdanovich for stretches last year. He was able to carry fantasy value, and then we definitely saw Buddy Hield able to carry fantasy value. So I would say this year I'm still mostly steering away from teams like the Kings. I don't know that there's another team out there that's quite as convoluted, maybe Brooklyn, in terms of who's actually going to be on the floor for 28 to 32 minutes a game. But I also do think that there are a couple of guys in that mix where you can pretty much say, okay, we're fairly certain this guy's actually going to be on the floor. It's some of the other spots where you say, you know what, it's not worth blowing a pick on this. The upside isn't high enough for me to really to gamble when there are other better gambles to make on the board. So this is a lot of sort ofs on today's show. I try not to put too many things in stone, especially not on September 5th. Okay, this is something I'm absolutely positively avoiding under any circumstance. There are injured guys. Head-to-head leagues, I think you have to tread a little bit more carefully because if a guy misses time at the end of the year, you're cooked. But when you're looking at it from a roto perspective, it all comes down to value. And even with the Kings, even with a team like the Kings, even with a team like the Nets, if certain guys fall far enough, you just kind of have to take them. Brett Michael Peter says, please rank in order for 9-cat. Spencer Dinwiddie, Josh Hart, Elfrid Payton, Bogdanovich. Just talked about him a moment ago. On this list, I would say Dinwiddie, Bogdan, Payton, and Hart. And I know that that's going to get me in some trouble. I am not at all bullish on Elfrid Payton. I don't think that a move to New Orleans fixes his fantasy game. You're probably looking at sort of a cheap version of what Rajon Rondo did last year for the Pels. And even Rondo, despite actually a pretty good assist-to-turnover kind of season, didn't hold true 9-category value for more than a week or two at a time. He fluctuated in and out of being roster relevant. Spencer Dinwiddie, we saw him carry significant value for long stretches last year. I know that there's a little bit of a logjam out there, but I think they like him. I think they realize that he makes them better. Bogdan, we saw him. He's going to be playing for Sacramento. And then, unfortunately, as much as I love Josh Hart as an NBA player, I think he's going to be a great fit. I think he's going to have a nice season for the Lakers. There just isn't enough meat on that bone out there. Not while the Lakers are healthy. And yeah, he'll play some time, but the Lakers they're too deep at basically every roster position. Young guy, old guy. And they've got LeBron, who's going to be soaking up the bulk of the fantasy value. So I just, I love Josh Hart, but in terms of fantasy, he's down near the bottom. There's an opportunity here. I might consider switching Bogdan and Dinwiddie just because of the minutes situation. Bogdan's safer. He's a safer play because he's likely going to have a greater opportunity. With Dinwiddie, he could get yanked around. There's D'Angelo Russell out there. They signed Shabazz Napier. It's just not as clear a path for him to 30 to 35 minutes, where with Bogdan, I think you can pretty much bank on him playing 28 minutes a game. The next question comes from a bit of an unlikely source. Our co-host here on Fantasy NBA Today, Hoop Ball Neil. No, it's Ball with Neil. We haven't decided on a new Twitter handle yet. How do you balance best value versus positional need as you draft? And more importantly, why do you hate Giannis Antetokounmpo? Obviously, the second half of that's a running joke. People think I hate Giannis because I just won't put him in my top 3. Best player available is pretty much the direction I go every time, and it has a way of working itself out for whatever reason. You obviously don't want to let it get too deep into the draft without getting a center or a point guard, but there are so many of those guys at the top of the list that you almost have to consciously dodge them to not end up with a center and a point guard after the first 4 to 5 rounds. Like somehow if you ended up with 4 or 5 wing guys, then you might actually be in a little bit of trouble. So I would say if you don't end up with a point guard or a center after the first 2 rounds, start to take a peek ahead, see what guys might be available around your next selection, perhaps give a very slight lean in their direction. But I would bet that very few of you, and this is just sort of the way the numbers bear themselves out on a year-by-year basis, if you end up with, let's say, Giannis in the first round, coming back the second round, you're probably going to end up with somebody that fills a point guard or a center slot. Or if you get a center in the first round, you might not get one in the second round. And I'm not as married to you got to get your center right out of the chute, you got to get your point guard right out of the chute. I think there are other ways to make up certain stats, but I don't have any beef with folks who do lean that direction. It's just not really the way that I function. And as it turned out, by the way, last year, the league where I got a center and a point guard in the first couple of rounds was the league where my team performed better. I don't think that it was a 1-to-1 correlation there. I think the rest of that draft I absolutely dominated because the center I got in the second round was Hassan Whiteside, and he didn't even end up having a good year. The point guard I got was Steph Curry, and he ended up playing 50-some-odd games too. So it doesn't necessarily make or break your team. I would argue that my top 2 picks in the other league I was in, Kevin Durant, who had a better season than Steph Curry, and Miles Turner, who had almost the same season as Hassan Whiteside, you could argue that those top 2 picks were actually better than the Steph and Hassan picks, but it came down to other guys that I got in those drafts, trades I was able to make, and that's what makes or breaks your team. There's a pretty easy way to survive ending up with 2 awesome wings, right? If somebody was like, hey man, you want to start your team with Kevin Durant and Jimmy Butler, you'd be like, yeah. You can go back and you can dress some of that other stuff later. Next question on the docket. Where is it reasonable to draft Kristaps Porzingis? The answer is don't. Not if you're not in a keeper league. Take him at the end of the draft. If you're in a keeper league, you save him up for next year. Coming back from serious injuries when you're not even due to get on the court until January or February is a very dicey proposition. We found that out this year with folks that drafted guys like Isaiah Thomas coming back from a hip thing, disaster year. Zach LaVine coming back from the ACL, disaster season. It's hard. The Kristaps, the Boogie draft picks, if you guys aren't planning on using these dudes in a head-to-head playoff format, I would not draft them. Simply wouldn't do it. It's too much. The burden of having one roster spot occupied the entire season is soul-crushing. You want to be rotating those bodies in and out. You want to be hunting for guys that can get you top 50, top 60, top 70 value on a week-by-week basis, and you're not going to be able to find them if you're not going to be able to add them, I should say, if you have that last roster spot completely occupied. The next question it comes from He D in 9cat. Is there a strategy you put together with regards to punting one or two categories? No, do not punt in 9cat. It's not enough categories to punt unless you're in a deep head-to-head league. That's your exception there. You can punt a deep head-to-head league because it's very hard to be good at all 9 categories when you're in a deep league anyway. And in head-to-head, all you need once going into the playoffs is a team that can win more categories than it loses. In a rotisserie situation, I never, ever, ever punt on draft day. There are times, as you've heard me say on this podcast, where I get to the midpoint of the season and I'm, bottom 3 in something. Usually it's points, by the way. That's the way it tends to go with the way I play this game. And what I can determine there is the guys on my team that are actually getting me points and are sort of floating me to keep me from hitting the bottom in that cat, I will often trade those guys for other categories where I can kind of bulk up. Because the most I could possibly lose would be 2 points if I'm 2 from the bottom in that category anyway. And if I can trade for a couple of guys that maybe get me 2 points each in different categories, bumps up in whatever it might be, then the ROI is positive. And that's what you're looking for in trade scenarios. Also, we're all aware of this. Teams stop setting lineups at the end of the year. So counting categories, you tend to actually get a few bonus points the last 2 weeks or so. As other people fade away, you can make a little push and pass those kind of, I like to refer to them as fantasy carcasses. They've just given up and dried up on the side of the road. So you don't even really need to be attacking a category. You'll just get a point or two in it because someone's going to give up. How do you approach a draft really? And if it's Dynasty, how much do you factor in potential over proven talent? We've talked about this before. I am not a Dynasty expert. It's why we talked to Adrian Benjamins. Perhaps I will put that one on the list for tomorrow's podcast. It's not a mailbag show, but it's me and Adrian, so we can get into the Dynasty stuff a little bit as well. Remind me if I don't do it. This is a question that's phrased a little bit confusingly. What about building based on a typical punt strategy? Free throws or assists? Same answer. Don't do it. Don't punt. Just don't. Just don't do it. You'll save yourself a lot of headache. Here's the thing. When you punt a category, you narrow your pool of players. I know it seems like you're actually expanding it. You're like, well, I'm punting, so I can draft Dwight Howard. But you're actually narrowing your pool. Because if you're punting free throws, you're not looking at great free throw shooters anymore. A guy like Damian Lillard becomes, well, not a first-round pick for your fantasy team. So you narrow the guys that you're actually drafting. So just don't do it. And if your team turns out to be awful at a category, then you can adjust partway through the year. It's a long NBA season. So don't punt. Gary Harris or Eric Bledsoe? Bledsoe. Ingles or Lauri Markkanen? Ingles. Slow-mo or Josh Richardson? Richardson. Top 10 players to target after the 100? Well, again, that's go back to that first answer. You guys have that same question. A lot of you. Here's an interesting one. You have the 10th and 15th pick in a 9-cat roto league. Would you risk it on Kawhi or would rather take Oladipo and Lillard? Who would you likely take at 15? No, too early to risk it on Kawhi. Didn't have to think about that one. If Kawhi's getting taken in the top 15, let someone else take that risk. Kawhi's a guy I'm looking at closer to 20. Not because I don't think he's going to exceed top 15, but there's so much risk involved in that where if your second-round pick doesn't pan out and you are you're a team on the turn, meaning you don't have a top 5 guy on your club, you probably can't weather that storm. If you have a top 5 guy, if you have Anthony Davis on your team and then you take a chance on Kawhi and he doesn't pan out, you still can survive that. Barely, but you could still survive it. But if you're sitting on Damian Lillard and Kawhi and you get nothing out of your second-round pick, you're done. You will not compete in that league. Just can't be done. So answer is yes. I think I would lean in 9-cat, probably ever so slightly to Lillard. I think Oladipo has a season where he comes a tiny bit back to earth, but I love both of them at that spot. I think Lillard probably ends up as your number 10 guy, and Oladipo probably number 11. So, you're 6 of one, half dozen kind of thing. At 15, I think you should be looking for guys like Paul George. I think he's a really good grab at 15. If he's off the board, I don't really like the way Yahoo has these things pre-ranked. I would probably look a little farther down for someone like Kyrie Irving, who often sits in that top 15 when he's healthy. He just hasn't been able to last through the year. I think there are other guys that have been bumped down the list a little bit that do belong a bit higher. Guys like Jimmy Butler, I'd rather take him closer to 20. 15 is a tough spot. I'll certainly argue that. It's a weird one. You could even take a chance on Chris Paul getting to 65 games this year because he'll be a top 9 player on a per-game basis, so you really only would need about 65, 70 games to get first-round value. To me, that's a better risk because at least you know that when he's healthy, he's going to be out there. Drew Holiday, Chris Middleton, Jimmy Butler. Which two of these are you keeping? Drew and Middleton. Butler is definitely starting to see the downtick of injury on his career. I assume this is for a dynasty format. If it's just for 1 year, I think I'd go Jimmy Butler and Drew Holiday. But if this is a long-term thing, you take Jimmy out of the mix just because of age. Next question comes from J-Ball. Oh, the last one was from Nasty. That's nasty. I like that. Just got on Twitter, by the way. Welcome. Welcome to the madness, and apologies because your life is now ruined. Say I was drafting Ben Simmons, and now I need to get some guys with positive free throw percentage. Yeah, you're stuck with a guy like Simmons, so you really do need to make a move in that other category, or your team's going to be in some real trouble. Who are the guys you would target? Well, there's a pretty easy answer to this question, and it's just go into the system and click on sorting guys by how they impact your team free throw percentage, right? I don't think you need me to necessarily list all those guys, right? Do we? I don't know. I guess we can give a few here. The tools, by the way, Basketball Monster is the site that has it right now. You simply click on sorting the players by the value of a particular category. So not the actual category itself, the value of the category, and you'll see that the guys that have the most positive impact on your free throw percentage are Damian Lillard, Steph Curry, James Harden, Danilo Gallinari, interesting middle round target there, Kevin Durant, Lou Williams, Devin Booker, Chris Paul, Jimmy Butler, Kyrie Irving, Chris Middleton, and then you get into Kevin Love, Kemba Walker, Jamal Murray, J.J. Redick, Cat, Anthony Davis. Ricky Rubio is actually up on that list as another middle round guy to throw in with someone like maybe Redick or Gallo. Jokic, Aldridge, DeMar DeRozan, Evan Fournier. That one might surprise you a little bit. Decent positive free throw percentage guy. Who else jumps out at this list? Marc Gasol. He's a 40-something type ranker. Darren Collison, Jeff Teague. Dario Saric actually was very helpful at the free throw line last year. He was often overlooked. Malcolm Brogdon, should he play more this season? Dirk still, somehow, by the way. Enes Kanter, Harrison Barnes, C.J. McCollum, Lowry Markkanen, Taurean Prince, Jason Tatum. So there's a lot of guys out there that can help you with free throw percentage. Obviously, if you can get your hands on someone up near the top, that would be a 1-1 balance, right? Like if you have Damian Lillard knocking down 92% of his free throws and taking 7 or 8 per game, that can counterbalance Ben Simmons basically with one player. But if you're stuck with someone, if you're stuck stockpiling a few guys, you might need J.J. Redick and Courtney Lee and Darren Collison. So you kind of have to look at it from that perspective. Can you make an entire team that's also really good? Or, heaven forbid, you avoid the guys that kill a single percentage of yours or single category. That's why I tend to dodge some of these dudes. I know, everybody loves Ben Simmons. He's cool, man. He's a good basketball player. But that free throw percentage is a drag. And head-to-head, do you ever draft on schedule considering amount of games for the finals? Jason, yes, absolutely. Make sure you have the schedule in front of you. It is available in the Hoop Ball Draft Guide. You can buy that for $13.99 right now. Stewart says, please rank 9-Cat, Drummond, Gobert, Capella. I would flip Gobert and Capella just because of the injury risk. Andre Drummond is number 1 in that one. If Gobert stays healthy, he could actually be the number 1 guy in that 3-pack. So from a value perspective, Rudy Gobert might be the best pick in that bunch. But from a straight projections standpoint, he is probably the one you'd have to put in 3rd place. Is Nerlens Noel a sleeper pick, asks Mike. No, I don't think he's going to play very much this year. And that is the mailbag. 50-some-odd minutes of beefy mailbag action. Long podcast today. Goodness. Lots of really good questions that came in later into the evening and overnight. Wanted to try to get all of those out on this episode. We'll try to do more of these mailbag shows as we run up towards the start of the season. I know people have a ton of questions. Let me also say here at the end of the podcast, again, please take a moment to rate and review the show. But if you want to get these questions answered and you don't want to wait for a mailbag pod, which, maybe I'll do one of those a week, go to the Hoopball forums. They're starting to pick up steam again as people begin to pay attention to basketball, fantasy basketball in particular. Hoop-ball.com, click on the forums tab. I am watching those forums all day, every day, like a hawk. And if you ask a question that I have the answer to, I will write the answer to it in those forums. Have a wonderful Wednesday, everybody. Adrian and I talking Dynasty on tomorrow's pod, and then Adrian and Neil will wrap up the week here on Fantasy NBA Today. Thanks again for rating and reviewing the show if you are inclined to do it. If not, please subscribe to the podcast. That's the other really important thing that we need from all of you loyal listeners here at The Hoob. I am Dan Besbris, at Dan Besbris on Twitter, DanBesbris. We'll talk to you tomorrow.
This has been a Hoop Ball presentation.